Welcome to Customer Strategy and Planning 2020, helping you to learn, share and transform to raise standards in customer operations. And welcome to another one of our fantastic keynotes. And again, we'll shortly hand over to our new keynote speaker, Chief Innovation Officer Stu Dorman at Sabio. What will he be touching on today? Well, every business has had to adapt to meet the uncertainty and changing demands of our customers and our colleagues this year. More so than ever, we have got that real sort of turbulence, uncertain, novel and ambiguous landscape out there. In that, digital adoption has leapt forward, arguably a decade. However, many of us are still playing catch up to that, to our new demands of our customer. Now, fortunately, our keynote speaker today is going to help you to bridge that gap with lots of practical takeaways. So whatever your starting position, whether you are one of those pioneers with technology or whether you are one of those perceived laggards a little bit behind where others are, I am certain you're going to get a host of ideas. So get a pen ready, get a good bit of paper ready, make sure you can write down loads of notes. Don't just rely on watching this again on demand, though it will be available later on today. You will all get a obvious next step. So I'd like to invite our Chief Innovation Officer from our gold sponsors, Sabio. Stu, are you there?
Hi, Phil. Yeah, I'm all here. Thank you. Great to be here. How you doing?
Yeah, and I will pass over to you. I look forward to the keynote again. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. Thank you very much, everyone. Let me just, there we go. I can see my slides now. Thanks very much for joining. It's great to be here. Really enjoyed the conference so far. As Phil said, I'm going to talk to you a bit about digital technology and digital acceleration and what we've been seeing over the last decade and how we see that accelerating as we move forward, sort of beyond the pandemic situation that we're in. So as I mentioned, for the last decade, we've been living through this era of unprecedented change. For those of us as consumers that have chosen to embrace modern technology, almost every aspect of our lives has been transformed through digital applications. Now, it's really easy to take for granted this amazing digitally connected world that we live in, but you don't have to go back too far in time to a period where none of this really existed. So it was just over a decade ago, just over 10 years ago, when Sainsbury's first introduced the concept of online grocery shopping to their customers. Now, before that, the last major innovation in grocery shopping was the invention of the supermarket well over 50 years ago. And we haven't really seen a huge amount of innovation in that space ever since. So this idea that I could suddenly go online and jump on a website or, over time start to use my mobile app to start to do my weekly shop was a revelation. Now I can go to the app, I can do my shop, I can select a time of my choice to get my groceries delivered to my house. I can check reviews, I can check the availability of stock. Something that I used to spend 3 or 4 hours a week on, my weekly grocery shop, can now be done really in a matter of minutes. So this time saved and the overall convenience to us is incredible. I think it's something that we take for granted now. It's not just our shopping that's been impacted over the last decade as well. If you think about, as another example, traveling, I mean, think about ordering a taxi before Uber came along. We used to stand on a cold street, put our arms in the air, get soaking wet, wait for a taxi to come along and get to the destination that we went to. Now, we can open up our app on Uber, we can click on a button, we can see exactly where the taxi is, all of the payments are taken care of. It's such an easy process. The friction has been taken out of that process. The same goes for things like getting train tickets or even getting, flights when we used to be able to take those. All of that can be done digitally now. We can download the ticket, it allows us to much more easily transition and carry the journey out. Equally, we can get information on our destinations from TripAdvisor, or we can book places all over the world using Airbnb. None of these things existed a decade ago, and they're providing me now with more choice, more convenience. They're shaving precious minutes off of tasks that used to take me a long time to do, and it's providing me with way more convenience and giving me the time back that I want to be doing, to focus on things I actually want to be doing. Think about paying for things as well. Now I can take out my phone and I can transfer money to anywhere in the world within a few clicks. And I can secure that using biometrics. I can look at my phone, or I can use my fingerprint to get this secured. You know, how amazing is that? It's super secure. I can use my watch to make payments. I no longer have to carry cash. I no longer have to carry my wallet around. And even things like open banking, these innovations can allow me to keep track of all of my spending and download the transactions into a single place to track my budget. All of these things are taking friction out of the process. They're adding convenience, and they're giving me more information. The same applies to educating. Think about the way that we educate ourselves now. Google Classroom and innovations like that have really transformed the way that certainly my kids carry out their homework and engage with their teachers and their fellow classmates. They can access applications like Wikipedia to find huge amounts of information on what's going on. People can access, the world's greatest teachers through the Khan Academy free of charge. Anyone with an internet connection and a cheap computing device can access a world-class education, and that's being, made available to people throughout the world now through nearly, near global internet penetration. It's incredible how this current generation of school children have embraced technology and how quickly this has happened. All of this is being underpinned by this global digital infrastructure, which is rapidly expanding. We started the last decade with the rollout of 3G connectivity and 2 megabit broadband to most UK homes. And we now enter this new decade about to start to roll out 5G connectivity with speeds, currently 50 to 100 times faster, but soon to be many thousands of times faster than they were just 10 years ago. And all of this has driven this growth in cloud computing, which has enabled these amazing services like Uber and Instagram and, mapping and shopping and the digitization of money. Who knows what the next decade will hold once these new technologies start to avail themselves. This in turn has driven a huge explosion in the use of artificial intelligence, and predominantly that's been driven by all of this data that's becoming available through everything and everyone being connected. And this current boom that we're seeing in AI is driven predominantly by, as I say, the access of data and the use of deep neural networks and machine learning. But we don't really need to worry about all of that, the technology that underpins that. It's more how accessible that technology is to us now, and how easily we can use that in the context of customer service. And all of this, again, is being underpinned by this incredible growth in computing power. So we're kind of used to Moore's law, where the computing power would double every couple of years. When we look at the growth in AI capacity, it's doubling every 3.5 months. It's incredible the pace in which this is growing. So a huge democratization, a huge evolution in the way that we can use AI and machine learning technology. And I guess finally, what's really important is the democratization of technology as well. It's been just over 10 years since the launch of the iPad was released. And we shouldn't underestimate how this has simplified technology and opened up computing to a much, much wider audience than was previously available. A lot of people talk about these walled gardens, but what these walled gardens do is make people feel safe. They allow them to play with technology without worrying about viruses and making mistakes in terms of the way they use computers. So these types of devices have opened up computing to an entirely new generation. So all of this was going incredibly well. And then back in March, everything seemed to change. All of a sudden, we started hearing news about this fast spreading virus that initially we heard about in China, and then it suddenly spread to Italy. And then before we knew it, we were in lockdown here in the UK. And 6 months later, things have eased a bit, but we're looking forward to a winter where certainly restrictions are starting to tighten up a bit. So really that's had a fundamental change in the way that we use digital technology. We've really started to see this acceleration now. To start with, we saw this mass shift towards home working, which all in all has been incredibly successful. We've seen some heroic achievements, and I've heard all kinds of stories about people driving around, dropping laptops off at people's houses. Certainly our teams here at Sabio spent tons of time on the phone helping people out, getting home working up and running, sorting out telecoms issues, and lots of reports from businesses that what once would have taken them maybe 3, 5, 10 years even, they're achieving in a matter of days. So really businesses have overcome this risk aversion, and they've implemented change incredibly quickly. And it's left lots of people asking, how can we leverage some of the speed and agility that we've seen throughout COVID when things go back to normal? Now, there's no doubt that we've got a lot of work to do to operationalize this new way of working. But there's no doubt that home working is here to stay, and it will form a huge mix in terms of what we do going forward. What this also has done is created this irreversible shift in behaviour with people that maybe were a bit reluctant to use digital technologies, but have now been forced to do that. They've been FaceTiming their kids, and they've been forced to use other digital channels as part of their daily lives now. So the genie's out of the bottle. These people have started to use digital technology. They've been forced to use it, but actually, generally speaking, they've found it's worked pretty well for them. So if you think about your client base, I often think about this classic technology adoption curve where you've got your innovators and your early adopters and your early majority. Typically, those are going to be the clients of yours that have been the ones that have embraced digital. They've started to use your apps. They've really gone online and used your website, maybe started to use web chat and some of these technologies. Whereas the late majority and the laggards typically are the people who would still go to the bank and pay their checks in, or maybe pick up the phone and speak to you using the call center. These are the people now that have been forced to really use digital technology. They may be a bit late to the party, but they're starting to really embrace the benefits. And that's really what's driving this second wave of digital adoption and this massive acceleration that we're seeing at the moment. So these are the people that have now been forced to do their grocery shopping online. They've now, they can't go to the shops. They've had to stay at home in many cases. So they've had to do their grocery shopping online. Largely speaking, they've found it very successful for them. They've started to have to do their banking online as well. Again, previously they may have gone to the bank. Now they're having to go online, send money, make transactions and so on. And again, they found it to be pretty successful. Even when these people go out now to the shops, typically they're having to use contactless payments. They may be using their mobile phones, or certainly contactless payments to cards to make payments. And again, they found it to be very useful. So this is this forced digital behavior that's now taking place. So what we've got to think about is how can we replicate this in-store experience where we have shopkeepers there, we have people there ready to help people, with any inquiry that they have. How can we replicate that when somebody engages in a digital experience and goes online, for example? And there's a great analogy that I like to use, where if you can imagine a great shop assistant, if you go into a department store or maybe a local shop, that person in the store can look around and they can look in the store and they can see at any point, whether that customer is needing any help, whether they just have an inquiry, whether they're just browsing the store, or whether they're about to buy something. And we need to start thinking about that same principle when it comes to digital. Observing people as they're on the website, looking at their behavior and targeting them with assistance from the contact center. If those people look like they need help, or maybe they're going to struggle with making a purchase or maybe go somewhere else, we can target those people and make sure that we deliver a great experience for them. And for me, that's what we've got to do to link together the digital experiences with the contact center. So there are 5 key things that I'd like to focus on as takeaways for this. First of all, start thinking about the customer journey and the call to action. What's the first thing the customer does when they reach out and engage with your brand? How are you generating that call to action? And typically we know that call to action, it might start with a letter, it might start with an email that you send to them, it may even start with a conversation in the pub. But the first thing that customer is going to do, typically they'll go to Google, they'll search for your brand, and they'll find a way of interacting. And we've been doing some really great work with Google here to try to embed messaging capabilities directly from within a Google search or within Google Maps. So you'll notice, in the example that you can see on the screen here, historically what you would have seen from Google is a click on a phone number or maybe a click on a button to go to the website. They've introduced this new icon here where we can click to do messaging, and we can sit a chatbot behind that messaging, ask the customer why they're calling, and maybe if it's a general inquiry, we can direct them towards the website. Or if it's if it's something we need to talk to them about, we can escalate that straight into the contact center, either on a chat channel, on asynchronous messaging, or on voice. So think about the call to action, think about embedding this. It's really easy to get set up and running. We can help you with that straight away. It's a super efficient way of starting that conversation with customers. The second thing that you need to do is think about customers that are engaging on digital properties that you have, whether it be a website or a mobile app. And you've got to think about, are you measuring demand effectively from these properties at the moment? What a lot of people do is they'll use Google Analytics or Adobe to track what people are doing online. But what they can't do is track what happens when that customer leaves the website and then transitions into the contact center. But there's all kinds of methods that we can deploy to do that, whether it be using callback technology or dynamic phone numbers, to actually start to bridge together the digital experience with the contact center. Now, this is really important because anything is, up to 60% of the demand into your contact center comes through your website. So it's really important to understand which pages are causing people to pick up the phone. Is it the content? Is it not working properly? Or at the very least, how can we make sure that when the call does transition to the contact center, we can pass that context through and use it for routing purposes, or make sure that the agent's prepared, to answer the contact, or even, pass through the identity of the customer so we know who we're dealing with. So first it will measure it, then target it, and ultimately you can use that information to start deflecting it. So the third piece is around using AI technology and conversational user interfaces in particular to start to understand why people are calling. And if any of you joined the session that we ran earlier on today, you'll see how quick and easy it is to do this. You shouldn't be scared of AI. The majority of organizations are still using basic IVRs where you can only get a very small number of reasons for calling. But what we showed earlier on with AI is how we can very quickly scale it to get tens, maybe even hundreds of reasons as to why people are calling, and we can use that information to make routing decisions, to deliver call deflection, and ultimately to deliver automation. And as we showed earlier on, it's super easy to get up and running with this now. You shouldn't be scared of it. We can start, within a matter of hours and deploy this technology. And then once it's live, it can learn, we can train it, and we can gradually iterate over time, over a matter of weeks, to train it to very high levels of accuracy very quickly. So think about deploying AI on voice channels, on chat channels, and asynchronous messaging channels. So the fourth piece is thinking about how we then escalate that to an agent. And there's a couple of key things here. First of all, we need to think about the tools that agents have to be able to deal with customers. And this is particularly important now when we've got more people working at home, perhaps on laptops with smaller, real estate, screen real estate that they're dealing with. Maybe in the contact center, they had a couple of screens. Now they've got a small laptop screen to deal with. So it's really important that we look at the user experience that we're giving to agents to make sure they have information at their fingertips to be able to answer customer inquiries as quickly as they possibly can. So thinking about the UI from an agent perspective, we've always thought about it from a customer perspective, building websites and apps. We've got to think about it from an agent perspective as well. And then the second thing here is to provide agents with tools to introduce digital channels alongside voice. So if my agent at home is sat with somebody and they're having a voice conversation, it's very easy now to allow them to click on a button, particularly where we've got more and more people at home, maybe they're near an iPad or a screen. We can start to introduce a digital channel to allow them to enrich the conversation, much in the way that we're doing now, much in the way that we do when we have Teams or Zoom conversations. We can start to introduce digital content. And the way I like to think of this is that it's much easier for us to read, much quicker for us to read than it is for us to listen. So therefore, think about your agents, or the customer absorbing information. And equally, it's much quicker for us to speak than it is for us to type. So think about that when we're introducing that to a chatbot conversation as well, and using visual information to push content back to the customer. So the fifth piece is then what we call augmenting the experience from a customer perspective. And this is a relatively new technology, but it's something that we're seeing a huge amount of interest at the moment. And what this is to use AI not to address the customer, as we talked about earlier on, but to be there to support the agents. And in this situation, we have an AI listening to the conversation that the customer's having with the agent the whole time. And it's there constantly serving up suggestions or knowledge articles or next best actions, or making sure that compliance statements are read correctly, or even filling out forms on the agent desktop to help them with the process of engaging with the customer. So think about using AI to support agents, to listen in, act as a coach, and help the agent, to have the information at their fingertips to deliver a great experience to the customer and ultimately reduce handling times. And again, this is particularly important in the current situation where we've got agents working at home. They can't just put their hand up now and ask their supervisor to come over. But what we can do is tune the technology to listen out for things that the customer might be struggling with, and then bring a supervisor in to help out if we need to. So think about using AI to augment that experience. Now, all of the things I've just gone through, all of these 5 suggestions are experiments that it's very quick and easy to get up and running with. You can run these today, and we can get up and running in a matter of days with these things. It's very easy to test and learn, and if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But it's easy with cloud technology to get up and running and trial some of these things out. And I think for me, this is the key thing. For too long, the contact center hasn't kept pace with digital transformation. As I mentioned at the start, we've seen a huge transformation in the way that we conduct our lives digitally over the last decade, but that hasn't really touched the contact center up until now. But the great thing now is that all of these tools are available to us in the world of contact centers. We can switch these technologies on really quickly. We can consume them on a transactional basis. We can use the cloud to drive change. And so the technology that's underpinned digital transformation over the last decade has now been available to the contact center, and we can run these experiments to take us into the digital age. So at that point, I'd like to finish the session and hopefully open up to a few questions if anyone's got any. So let's see if we've got any questions coming through.
That is superb. Thank you so much, Stu. Really enjoyed that. Again, I've got a lot of notes here, but absolutely, I will invite that to all of our viewers. I've got over 50 people watching live. Put your comments in, put your questions in, and we'll have a look at those shortly. Just whilst I'm reflecting back, I think one thing that really stood out to me today actually is when, again, you talk about those top 5 things. I was one around the user experience and the colleague experience. One of the conversations I've had a lot with organizations is about comparing productivity when it was in the office to at home. And actually, one thing that you highlighted here is in the office, people do typically have 2 screens now. They've gone home with a laptop. And that the reason for having the 2 screens was because it was more productive to have your 2 screens. You've now gone back and we're not doing a like-for-like comparison. And it's interesting, something as small as that can make such a big difference. So again, it's one of those things that if people aren't doing that, that's a very easy, quick win for you. But again, I think seeing that link between, instead of being fearful of, say, AI replacing jobs, this is there to enhance both the customer experience in anticipating what their next move is, and around really sort of developing the understanding and learning of their needs, but then really supporting the agent, because all frontline advisors will moan when it's the same problems that keep coming their way and when they don't feel empowered to be able to actually do anything. So if you've got AI to support you, and that can only be a great way forward, really. So that's something that really stood out to me. The other point that I again really stood out was around that bridging the gap between the digital experience and then the contact center experience, because again, still many organizations have a huge gap there. They've got a great website, they've got a great app, but then the moment the phone call comes through, absolutely, they're sort of missing that sort of full end-to-end customer journey, which I think is something everyone needs to spend some time working on. Okay, well, let's see if we have got some questions. Hopefully one is going to appear on screen any second. Here we go. Again, a good question here. So what are the typical blockers when implementing new technologies? Yeah, so what are people fearful of? Is it a certain project team? Is it the wider business? Or is it just actually some organizations tend to have a bit of a fear maybe of not wanting to embrace new technology?
That's a really good question. I think, for me, historically, particularly in the contact center world, and this is where it differs from digital. I think in the contact center world, projects have been, they've taken a long time. They've required huge amounts of upfront investment. You're almost placing a bet in some ways that project will deliver some sort of return on investment. And, everyone starts work and it's like 6 to 12 months later, you switch it on, it goes live, and then you just hope, that it delivers on its planned ROI. And I think, that understandably makes people a little reluctant to put their career in some cases behind some of these huge projects. The big change for me now is that because of the nature of the technology that we're dealing with, that has been available in the digital world, if you like, for the last decade or so, and is now becoming available in the contact center, we can start small, start quickly, iterate, and nudge the project in a different direction as we learn from real customer data and interactions. And what that means is, you're not placing these huge bets. You're learning over, a much shorter periods of time. We've got this concept of continuous deployment, continuous integration, continuous innovation, where we're using customer data to deliver capability 1 week at a time or 1 day at a time in some cases, and that means we can be much more agile and take things in a different direction if the original idea that we had doesn't work and actually customers respond to something differently. So for me, the big blocker has historically been, you know, the huge bets that you would have to place. And the antidote to that is the fact that you can do things in a much more agile way now and test and learn, you know, over time.
Yeah, I think that's sort of failing fast, isn't it? Failing fast, failing forward is a good sort of cultural mentality for businesses. Just on that, Stuart, have you seen, I suppose, the demands for ROI become quicker now? Whereas once upon a time, people would have given 5 years to get your ROI back. Do you think it's much quicker now, maybe months as opposed to years?
I think we're definitely seeing, you know, an increase in expectations and demand about what technology can do. And, you know, as you know, we need to, people are looking for much faster proof points of whether the technology can deliver or not. But like I say, you know, I think that's okay as long as you start to think about things in small, you know, chunks, and you are prepared to fail. You know, you are prepared to make mistakes, but see that as a learning experience, and culturally as an organization accept that failure is a good thing as long as you learn from that failure and you change direction based on what you learn.
Yeah.
So, and obviously that impacts ROI as well, because, you know, one of the things that we touched on earlier on was, you know, it's okay to start an experiment and initially start by capturing data, because it's the data that will inform your ROI. But you've got to start capturing data first. And again, that's the difference, I think, now, is that you can very quickly prove your hypotheses, if you like, and challenge them and maybe reevaluate them, which in turn will change your outlook on the ROI. So.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I love the expression of proof point. It's much better than the hurdle rate, which is very, very financial driven, isn't it? But yeah. Again, an example of that, I was reading an article earlier today around Amazon Marketplace, and that actually started sort of 10 years earlier as Amazon Auction, and it didn't work. It failed. However, they used that to improve it, to create Amazon Marketplace, which is now 50% of its sales. So it's
Amazon's so interesting for me, because they are, you know, what you see from Amazon is all the successes, but for every success there are literally 100 failures that sit behind it. And there's a great quote from Jeff Bezos, which is, success at Amazon is directly proportional to the number of experiments they run per year. And there have been so many failures at Amazon, but from that, you know, 1% of those to success, and they turn into huge successes. So great point.
Definitely. Okay. Other questions? Let's have a look. There we go, like magic. On the Google search push to chat, how important is a good chatbot to making this effective? Great question.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think a good chatbot is always, you know, important. And I think one of the things that people, you know, maybe underestimate in some ways is the thought that goes into the design and the dialogue management of a chatbot, and the way that you ask a question and the way that you respond to something. So that is important, thinking about design. But equally, I think it's, you know, it's fine to start with something that doesn't really know much to start with. It's a bit like when you have a new agent that starts in your call center, right? You know, day one, they don't really know a huge amount. They can probably ask a question and get a response, but you need to think about, you know, coaching them and training them so that they can very quickly learn how to do things. And the same applies to a chatbot. It's fine to start with a simple chatbot, ask the customer their intent, find out why they're calling, maybe escalate it straight away, and then use the data that you collect over time to tune the chatbot to build out its capabilities.
So just on that point, sorry, Steve, I've got to say, do you think people are less patient with a chatbot? There's almost a higher expectation that this is the solution and it should be quicker than a person?
It's difficult to say. I think, as with all of these things, you know, it's a bit like when the first websites came out. You know, there were so many examples of terrible websites, and some people got it right because they thought about design. The same thing happened with IVRs and touch tones when they came out, and the same principle applies to chatbots. You know, people get their hands on the technology and maybe necessarily don't think about the design aspect of it. And you know, that's the way these things evolve. But I think over time, as we see now, you know, people start to realize that to really get the most value out of them, you need to think about design, and that starts to become more of an important, you know, aspect of it.
Definitely, yeah. Who'd have thought? Thinking it through before we start. But okay, have we got any more questions? Let's have a little look. Oh, here we go. A personal one. In your experience, how many chats should be associated be able to handle at one time? Wow, a bit of a concurrency type question for, I assume, web chats there on this one.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you guys at the forum have got a ton of best practice around this. I mean, in my experience, I think 2 to 3 seems to be the maximum, depending on what sector you're in. That's slightly different when you think about asynchronous messaging, where conversations tend to extend over a much longer period of time. But Phil, what's your thoughts on this?
Yes, so I think again, it's one of these questions that we need to be really careful when we benchmark. I remember talking to a charity once. It wasn't Childline, but it was that sort of dealing with vulnerable people. So not surprisingly, one chat at once, because the last thing you could do there is get any chats mixed up, because you didn't want to give the wrong response to it. Talking to some of our other larger telecom organizations, it is possible at some point for 7 and 9 concurrency to go on. However, these are quite transactional, and you could almost argue could probably be automated, that behind it. So again, when you look at those numbers, it could really skew actually what an average should be. I always think, though, there is a classic. I know I'm a man answering this question. You can only do one thing at once. So unless you've got 2 keyboards, okay, you're only answering to one. So you do always need to think about that. So yes, there may be a multiple queue there. You're actually only dealing with one thing at once, and look at it more of how productive can that person be going from one thing to another, based on the complexity of the type of work that's coming in, and also a little bit of the risk of getting it wrong. And if you sort of match those 2 things together, you're going to end up with like probably a 2 to 3 again, depending on handle times. But again, look at it from that sort of productive perspective. The other thing I would link this to as well is thinking about to one of our other keynotes, which is the strategic planning one. And again, often when people bring in, say, web chat, they think of this going to be, it's going to lower demand or deflection, and actually often increases demand. So again, you've got to be careful with those tracking measures of success. But again, I'd be happy to follow that conversation up with whoever has answered that question.
One other point I'd add to that as well is, I think this is where, when I touched the last point around augmenting, experiences and using AI sat behind a person to offer suggestions. And I think this is really where we can start to drive up productivity, where, if somebody asks a question, we can offer some suggestions. So the agent's still in control of the conversation, but they might have a couple of different suggestions as to what the right answer might be. And simply by clicking on that answer, that they can become much more productive and have a really nice, answer to that customer's question that factors in all kinds of different things and is relevant to the conversation they're having. So that's where I see AI kind of not taking over completely, but supercharging what a human can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost acting as the triage, isn't it, to support that? Yeah, no, I like that. That would be interesting to see. Okay, have we got any more questions? Let's have a little look. Oh, here we go. Okay, disadvantages. What are the disadvantages of being one of those pioneers, that sort of small percentage on the bell curve that you showed before?
So I thought I look at this, from 2 angles. One is as a consumer, and I like to think of myself as being a first adopter and trialing out these new things. But then you've got as an organisation, being a kind of technology pioneer. If we think about it from an organisation perspective, and Amazon's a great example. We touched on this earlier on. The disadvantage really is that you are going to fail. There are going to be mistakes that you make. And it's really important to have a culture of failure and embracing failure, to be prepared that things are going to go wrong. If you're right at the leading edge, you are going to make mistakes. You're going to be pioneering things, and things are going to go wrong. As long as you have a culture that accepts that and you're able to learn from that and adapt to it, I think that's fine, and that's exactly what people at Amazon have, and that's why they're so. That's why they're the biggest company in the world, right? So, that's the key disadvantage, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah. No, again, good answer. And I suppose, I suppose we ask the opposite then. What's the disadvantage of being or I suppose what are the advantage then of being a laggard? I suppose is the direct opposite question to that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess the advantage is, you are minimizing risk. You're maybe sweating your assets from a technology perspective as long as you can, and I think that's fine. But I think with the whole ethos behind this presentation, this concept of digital acceleration, I think we're going to start quickly finding that customers are accelerating in their expectations. So I think being in the laggard, certainly when you look at contact centers and customer experience more generally, I think it's going to be increasingly less acceptable to have disjointed experiences, you know, to not use AI anywhere in your journey, to not plan effectively, you know, to sweat your assets for too long, because your experience will be left behind. And I just think that's, you know, consumers are going to be much less tolerant of that as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Okay, let's see. Have we got one final question in there? I think we do have time. Yeah, it's interesting watching about six measures of success. So I think not just thinking financial, what other sort of measures do you often see organizations looking for now?
I think, you know, the classic ones really for me, I mean, still first contact resolution is important, and, you know, making sure that you're solving the customer's problem as quickly and as efficiently and as effectively as you can. And clearly there are both financial implications of that, but also customer satisfaction implications of that. I still think, you know, fundamentally that's a really important thing to track. Looking at, you know, repeat contacts and you know, and making sure that you're aware of that customer experience across all the different channels. So I still think that's the most important thing. But, you know, obviously we have the kind of looking at your AI and your chatbots and your virtual assistants in the same way that you look at your agents, and making sure that they are containing as many contacts as possible, answering questions with a high level of satisfaction. And I think the other thing as well, like I mentioned in the presentation, is to make sure that you have a grip on the demand that hits your contact center that comes through your digital assets, whether it be your mobile or your websites. Hardly anyone does this. It still amazes me now that they don't. I think it's really important to understand what traffic's leaking from the web into the contact center, track it, and only when you know and track it can you start optimizing it.
Yeah, no, great question. So I was just writing down there about first call resolutions. We've got a workshop at our November conference that's going to touch on that very topic, and around measuring it, and then secondly around managing it. So there's the two aspects of it there, which I think could be really interesting. But you're right, I think customer journey, that cost per serve, those sorts of factors there should be bring together almost a balanced scorecard of success measures as opposed to one single one.